Welcome back. During the decades that followed the Second Vatican Council, the deep-seated tension between religious life and clerical leadership became more intensified. After years of somehow quietly accepting a perceived subservient position vis-a-vis the clerical leadership, religious found themselves at a very important realization that, according to the Second Vatican Council, the religious state does not belong to the hierarchical structure of the Church. Nevertheless, it belongs inseparably to her life and holiness. In so saying, the Council acknowledged the very uniqueness of the consecrated life and affirmed that it related to the clerical leadership not in terms of submission, but in terms of communion. Thus, both ecclesial realities are supposed to be mutually supportive of each other and are in collaboration with each other under the guidance of the Spirit. Given this affirmation, however, there were many of us who began to dismiss the clerical leadership for reasons that could be well justified, but dismissing it as helplessly broken, inflexible, and deaf. Matters turned worse for many during the long pontificate of Pope John Paul II, when many truly felt the dismissiveness of several bishops toward religious congregations that were more forward-looking, and their favor was towards those that were externally traditional and thoroughly docile to their bidding. It was a sad time indeed, a period when many bishops and higher clerics forgot the following bidding from the post-conciliar document Mutuae Relationes. Quote, "All pastors, mindful of the apostolic admonition never to be a dictator over any group that is put in their charge, but to be an example that the whole flock can follow, will rightly be aware of the primacy of life in the Spirit. This demands that they be at the same time leaders and members of the people of God, truly fathers, but also brothers, teachers of the faith, but also fellow disciples of Christ, responsible for the perfection of the faithful, but also true witnesses of their personal sanctification." End of quote. Unfortunately, however, there were those among us in the consecrated life who saw themselves, and every religious as well, as mandated by God to prophesy solely against the clerical structure of the Church altogether. That it was part of our common calling to expose the arrogance of the clerical leadership and to do away with its structure. For these fellow religious, that was what being prophetic solely meant. Unfortunately, the arrogance they condemned could also be leveled against them as they made themselves into self-appointed prophets. Good-willed, yet horribly misguided, they forgot that all of us who are part of the people of God, be they religious, clerics, or lay, are by our baptism all called to be prophets. Thus we, consecrated men, are not the only ones called to be heralds of the truth, and we could not and should not arrogate that role as if it is ours by right alone. In a far more desirable situation, all of us who constitute the Church truly understand that although the mission of the people of God is one, that is, to be a visible sacrament of the love and mercy of God for all women and men, we all approach and live our responsibilities differently from each other. The distinctiveness between clerical leadership and religious life is very clear, although contingent, and does affect both the exercise of the pastoral ministry of bishop and priests and the particular life form and duties of religious. Clearly, given these differences, it is easier for us consecrated men and our clerical leaders to emphasize the points that differentiate us from each other. But what is seemingly the deeper call of the Second Vatican Council is for us to come to a clear acceptance and appreciation for the differences in our gifts for the church and the world, instead of using them as a means to divide us and to distance ourselves from each other. We have already noted that the Council affirmed that while the religious state is part of the life and holiness of the Church, it does not belong to its hierarchical structure. Religious congregations, particularly those like us that have a pontifical status, possess an autonomous character that ecclesial leadership are called to recognize, keep, and protect by canon law. Quote, "The Church is concerned that institutes should grow and develop in accordance with the spirit of their founders and foundresses and their own sound traditions. Consequently, each institute is recognized as having a rightful autonomy, enabling it to follow its own discipline and to keep intact its spiritual and apostolic patrimony. It is the responsibility of local ordinaries to preserve and safeguard this autonomy." The distance that each religious congregation establishes in its relationship with the clerical leadership is among the most notable and subtle aspects in a congregation's charism. In fact, this dimension can significantly differentiate one religious congregation from another. However, religious congregations should not be expected to relate in the same way with the clerical leadership. Although they are not in a submissive relationship with the hierarchy nonetheless, it would be wrong for religious congregations to isolate themselves from the clerical leadership and see themselves as totally autonomous. There will always be the temptation for consecrated men and women to have fewer dealings and association with the Church's leadership. But our canonical autonomy should not be construed as giving us the license to operate at will without thinking with the mind of the Church, or as in Latin, sentire cum ecclesia, and thus disregarding our relationship completely. What is the sense, then, of being part of the Catholic Church if this were to happen? Founders like Theodore James Ryken clearly understood that they were part of the Church, holy, but comprising of imperfect people, with clerical leaders whose visions of the Church and understanding of the gospel may be less desirable and less in keeping with the biddings of Christ. Not a few of these founders, just like Ryken, had to suffer in the hands of bishops who wanted ultimately to control the inner life of their congregations. However, we must not forget that we as a congregation had been blessed with the kindness and understanding of successive bishops of Bruges who, despite their questions about Ryken, were able to discern that the brotherhood he was founding was truly unique in its calling, that it was willed by God to exist for the sake of the life of the Church, and also bishops who were willing to let go of their total control over its jurisdiction so that it can be a brotherhood for the whole Church. What our history informs us then is that we Xaverians should never see ourselves as being separate from the clerical leadership of the Church. However, we need to be truly aware of what Ryken understood as, quote, the congregation's first intention, spirit, and vocation. Our call is to be faithful to it and present it before the clerical leaders of our parishes, our dioceses, as well as of the universal Church, to present this as our unique gift for the fulfillment of the reign of God in the here and now. We end this presentation by asking you to reflect and share on the following questions. Number 1, was there any particular point in this discussion that strongly moved me, whether positively or negatively? Why am I affected by it? Number 2, which of the ideas conveyed at the last part of this discussion concern me most as a challenge to the way we are called to relate to the church's clerical hierarchy? Why? Don't forget to send the results of your reflection and discussion to the Coordinating Committee for the 27th General Chapter. Thank you very much for your active participation today. We hope to see you in the last installment of our presentations.